All right. Good evening, folks. Welcome to this is the second session of the Ontario Sheep Farmers Fall Speaker Series. Tonight we have with us Delma Kennedy, the provincial sheep specialist. Delma is going to talk on improving conception rates to lower cost of production. That's the theme for tonight. But before we get started on that, I just wanted to do a shout out to our sponsors. You can see them there on the screen. Without the sponsors, obviously, some of the producer ed projects that we do are not so easily done. So thank you to our sponsors. I guess just a bit of housekeeping before I turn the program over to Delma. If you have a question that is for clarity, i.e. that you want better explanation or you misunderstood something that Delma has said, please use the raise your hand feature or type it into the chat box. I will be monitoring the chat as Delma is presenting tonight. And otherwise, the rest of the questions, certainly feel free to type them in the chat box, but we will leave general questions and I'm going to say philosophical questions or to dig a little bit deeper into the subject matter. We'll leave those till the end of tonight's presentation. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Delma, if you want to share yours,
okay.
We will turn this over as you come on. The other thing, if someone or a number of you could just type in once Delma is speaking, how the audio is coming across to you in terms of clarity and volume, that would be much appreciated as well. So Delma, thanks for agreeing to be our presenter tonight, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Anita. So good evening. Tonight I'm going to talk about conception rates and sort of the potential effect on cost of production and a few of the factors that can affect your conception rates. So I guess one of the first things is, what is your conception rate and what does that mean? You can calculate it different ways. And, when you're talking to someone else and saying, what are your rates? What are my rates? It's good to just verify how you're calculating it so that you're talking about the same thing. So you can calculate it as the number of ewes that are pregnant when you preg scan them compared to the number that were in the breeding group, or you can calculate it as the number of ewes that lamb compared to the number that were in the breeding group. So in order to compare conception to cost of production, what really matters is the number of marketable lambs that you have per year. And so one of the problems, of course, is that conception isn't the only thing that affects that. And so these are some of the main factors, right? We've got number of lambs born, pre-weaning mortality, post-weaning mortality, what your lambing interval is, all of these things along with conception affect that number of marketable lambs per year. But conception is where it all starts, and we'll dive into first, what is a good conception rate, and then talk a little bit about what effect conception has compared to some of these other traits. So confounding all of that is there's a lot of factors affecting conception. We've got lambing interval, genetics, season, stress and environment, nutrition and body condition score, health, rams, age of the ewe. And so what is a good rate? And so if we look at a few research studies, they've, done a controlled study, the data is carefully recorded, and this makes it easier to try and pull out the effects and see what's going on. So in this first study, they looked at what are the differences between breeds. And so It was in season. It was between the years of 1984 and 1990, so quite a few years worth of data. The minimum age that they looked at was the animals had to be at least 18 months old. They had a 14-day teasing period, and they had a 42-day breeding starting the 3rd week in August, and they used 1 ram for every 50 ewes. And so they were trying to compare these different breeds. So they had Coopworth, Polypay, Suffolk, and then a bunch of crosses. And what this is talking about here is which, like when you have crosses, did the cross come, like did the Coopworth piece come from the sire side or the dam side? And so they crossed them both ways to see if anything made a difference. And so basically, when you look at this list, they're not significantly different, right? There's an average range of 93 to 97 with an overall average of about 95%. And so this gives us a reasonable idea of what can be expected. So if you use the ram effect, expose the ewes for 2 full cycles in season, and everybody's in good condition and everything's working the way it's supposed to be, 95% conception is not out of line. And so then this was a 5-year project done in Nebraska, and they used 1,800 crossbred ewes that lambed at 1, 2, and 3 years of age. And the ewes were mated by Suffolk rams for 35 days that began August 5th, October 15th, and December 15th. And then the August animals were teased for 17 days prior to breeding. And so when we look at this table, we get an idea of the difference between ages and then the difference between the month of breeding. And so, of course, we see the 1-year-olds have a lower conception rate. In August, they only got 40%, October 67%, and when they got to December, they were up to 75% for an overall average of 60.5% for the 1-year-olds. By the time they got to 2 years old, it was much better. The overall average was almost 91%, and they had 84% in August, 93% in October, and 95% in December. And then the 3-year-olds were similar. They did a little better in August. They were almost 88%, and then 94% in October and 94% in December, with an overall of 90.2%. And so this gives us an idea, once we get to 2 years old, we can expect them to give us sort of mature conception rates. And then as we go through the fall, we can see as we get deeper into those short days, we get better conception across all ages. And so in a follow-up study, they took those same ewes and they bred them annually on March 12th and on May 14th at 4, 5, and 6 years of age. And so when they did that, they exposed the ewes to a teaser ram for 16 days. The rams were light treated so that they had full capacity, right? So they did 6 weeks of 8-hour days, and then they semen tested them to make sure that they had good semen. And then they put them in for 42 days. And they were able to get very good conception rates in March. So they were looking at different breeds as well. So they got 82, almost 83% with the Dorsets, 91.5% in the Finns, 89.5% for Texels, 92% for the Romanovs, almost 88% for the Montadales, for an overall average of almost 89% in March, which is very good for the end of the season. And then in May, it wasn't as good, right? The overall average was 65.6%. And then we see some breed differences with 62.5% with Dorsets, 72% for Finns, 52% for Texels, 89% for the Romanovs, and 52% for the Montadales. And so the breed differences really start to show up here for those breeds that have longer or shorter seasons. And this was also done in the US, where they tend to, they're a little bit closer to the equator, and they usually can get a little better results than we sometimes can get here. And then another one looked at accelerated lambing. And so these were Rambouillet fin ewes that were exposed for 45 days to Suffolk rams on an accelerated breeding schedule in August, November, and April. And so on average, they got 90% conception rates in August, 79 in November, 53 in April, for an overall average of 74. And these were natural breedings only, and it was in Maryland. And so this one here is where they're using controlled reproduction or hormones. And so in this study is from the 80s. And so it used sponges. We don't have sponges anymore. We have cedars instead, but they work the same way. And so the sponges were put in for 16 days. They received PMSG on day 17. The ewes were all 2 to 5 years old. And they had previously lambed. They were weaned at 47 days postpartum. And then the sponges went in for 16 days, PMSG day 17, and then the rams went in. And so we've got control animals that were not treated with hormones, and then we've got animals that were treated with hormones on 2 different dates. And so you can see with the control animals, very few were showing estrus and nobody lambed. For the animals that received hormones, they all were showing, well, they weren't all, but a lot of them were showing estrus, like 82% in May, June, and 78% in July, August were showing estrus, but not nearly as many were lambing. And so since that time, one of the things that has come up with some of these studies is that they didn't always make sure there was no ram effect, right? So if the rams weren't light treated, or you didn't use semen, or you didn't semen test the rams, when it's out of season, sometimes some of the difference between what estrus and actually lambing was the effect of the ram. And so a number of years ago, we also did a sort of farm survey of conception rates. And we had 107 Ontario producers that responded. And so this is just some overall conception rates for flocks that responded to that survey. And so it's divided into accelerated and annual here. And so for ewe lambs and mature ewes together, the average conception rate was 76.6% on accelerated programs and 91.2% on annual programs. Now you'll notice, like in brackets, this is the number of ewes that were involved in that average. And you'll notice that if you add the ewe lambs and mature ewes together, it does not nearly come up to what both is. And that's because not everyone told us whether they were ewe lambs or mature ewes. And so so they went into the overall total, but they didn't go into these broken out categories. And so for mature ewes on accelerated, it was 77.4, and for ewe lambs, it was 72.7. And then annual was 85.4 for ewe lambs and 94.6 for mature ewes. And so these numbers are very good. And I mean, what I don't show here is there was quite a range. So when we asked some questions, breaking out some groups into season and things like that, there was quite a range in the conception rates that people got. depending on the season and depending on the particular group. And so if we're coming back to what is a good conception rate, after looking at, all of those numbers, I think we can kind of safely say that, a good average conception rate for in season would be 90%, and an excellent one would be 96% or more. And then out of season, sort of a good average conception rate would be 50 to 60%, and an excellent one would be 70 or more. And so this just gives us, some numbers that we can use to think about and compare to when we look at our own flocks. And so now what we really want to do is talk a little bit about the effect of conception on cost of production. And it's really about the expenses of keeping a ewe who doesn't have lambs to market and having to cover her costs for the whole year till she has an opportunity to lamb again. Because if you have a ewe that doesn't lamb, then you have fewer lambs to market, and it increases the overall average cost to produce a marketable lamb for the flock. And so how you value that is where it becomes more complicated. And so we're back to this, right? How do we value conception versus all of these other things that can happen that affect that cost, or increases the cost per marketable lamb because we have fewer to market. And so I made a bit of a stab at this. And I came across a couple of different research projects that attempted to do this. And so this first one, basically, this project was trying to estimate economic values for traits for Bulgarian dairy sheep flocks, okay, based on their actual costs of production. And so they basically came up with an economic model using their costs of production, and using the economic model determined how much the traits contribute. And so the total is 100%, right? So these traits added together give us 100% of the economic value. Okay, so these are the ones they considered. Now, there could be other things, but this is how it worked in the model that they had. And so milk was important for them, right? Liters per ewe, live weight at birth, growth rates, mature weight of ewes, and that's because it affects how much feed, wool yield, because they get some money for wool, the conception rate of ewe lambs, the conception rate of mature ewes, number born, survival rates, and productive lifetime of the ewes are the traits that they considered. And so when they did that, they said that mature ewes, the conception rate of mature ewes was worth 11% of that. So when you look through the numbers, that puts it, higher than it puts it higher than wool yield, for example. It's more important. It's higher than survival rate in the first 24 hours, and it's higher than survival rate after 24 hours. But it's less than the two of those together. So this just gives you an idea of how it worked out for them with their costs of production and the revenues that they got from different things. And so this starts to help us paint a picture of how important it is and what the value might be. And so this second one is a project done in Brazil on sheep meat pasture operations. And the objective was to analyze how traits affected cost of production. And so same kind of thing, just a bit of a different approach. And so in this case, the conception rate is called pregnancy rate. So it's right here. And for Brazilian pasture operations, it was estimated that for every increase of 1% conception rate, there was a decrease of 0.6141% of the total cost of production. So if I could change my conception rate from 90% to 91, my total cost of production would decrease by 0.641%. And so these are very different types of operations. And both of them have found that that conception rate is significant or has a significant effect on the cost of production. And so and you can see that they also looked at slaughter weight, hot carcass yield, lambing interval, prolificacy, so number of lambs, pre-weaning mortality rate, and number of ewes. So now, to try and get an idea of how important conception might be for Ontario producers, I've made a bunch of assumptions to come up with some numbers and some scenarios. So what I hope to accomplish is to give you an idea of the magnitude of difference there can be between good conception and excellent conception, so that you can think about your operation and decide if there's value in tracking conception and when to try and make changes. And so the first thing is just this little graph here is one of John Mollenhouse's from the benchmarking study that was done in sort of 2009 to 2011. And I put this up just as a reminder. When that benchmarking project was done, what this is telling us is that, this is net income per ewe by flock size. And so as flock size goes up, net income per ewe went up. But the real story here is that each of these dots is a different flock. And what was really surprising is the difference, right? So at any given flock size, there's huge differences between flocks on the income per ewe. And he had another graph that broke this out into capital and variable expenses. And if you just look at the variable expenses line or costs, it also looks like this, where there's a lot of difference between flocks. And so what this tells us is that there's a lot of small things that can make a big difference on sheep farms. And so I think, in some cases, conception is one of them. And so now if we start trying to sort of break that down on what the magnitude of these conception differences might look like. And so I've made some assumptions, right? So I've said that, in this little example, the lambing rate is 1.7%. So we're going to get 1.7 lambs for every ewe that's bred, and we're going to have 10% mortality. And I've done this so that we can come up with a number of potential marketable lambs. So if we have 100 ewes, as I've set up here, and we have 100% conception, then we'd have 170 lambs, we'd have 17 mortalities, and that would leave us with 153 lambs that could be marketed. And so then if we say, okay, what if conception was excellent instead of perfect? And we had 96%. So then we would have 163 lambs, we'd lose 16.3, and we'd have 147 that could potentially be sent to market. And so what I've done here on this bottom row is I've said, okay, what is the potential loss in income? And so I took the average selling price of a 103-pound lamb the week of November 9th to 15th, and it was $236.71 per head. And I multiplied that by the drop in number of lambs. Okay, so in this case, there are 6 lambs less. And so if you multiply this by 6, you get $1,420. Okay. And so then if we do the same thing for 90% conception and 85% conception, then you can see what the drop in revenue looks like by having fewer lambs because you had less conception. And that's assuming everything else that affecting marketable lambs stays the same, right? And so when we go from excellent conception to good conception, this a little more than doubles, right? Our drop in revenue a little more than doubles compared to if it was perfect. And so this gives you some sort of number that gives you a magnitude on what this means. And so then if we think about, that's in an annual system. And so if we think about an accelerating lambing system, this is where things get more complicated. And, you know, accelerated lambing is attractive for a bunch of reasons for producers, depending on your situation. It can potentially make better use of resources, improve your marketing opportunities, allow you to get more production from the same ewes. But one of the things that happens is, so if you start down this road and you start accelerating your use, one of the things that you do is you feel that you're getting better conception, right? If I say to somebody on an accelerated system, if you've been on an annual system, you switch to accelerated, you know, are you getting better conception? Your tendency would be, you know, yes, overall, I must be getting better conception because if a ewe doesn't breed, she has the next opportunity sooner. She doesn't have to wait till next year. But the other thing that happens is it gets much harder to track average conception rates over the year. And so I've got an example I made here. And so if we look at this, I'll explain how it works. So one of the things I've done is I've done the same where, you know, I've assumed that everybody is going to have 1.7 lambs born, just so that I can have numbers of lambs born, okay? And so what I've said is I've got 300 ewes, and I'm going to start off my system by breeding 200 ewes in August and 100 ewes in December. And so I'm going to say that my August breeding, I get 85% conception. And if you can remember back some of these numbers that we saw earlier, 85 seems kind of reasonable for August. And so if I did, I would have 170 ewes that lambed, and I would have 30 that did not. And I would have 289 lambs born. And so then in December, I breed my other 100 ewes and I get 95% conception. So I've got 95 ewes that are lambing and 5 that did not. And so then I get to my April breeding. And so when I breed in April, who is that, right? So who that is that's the ewes that were bred in August and just lambed and weaned their ewes. And it's this other 5 here who didn't get pregnant in December. And so now I've got 175 ewes. And it's April, so maybe I only get 60% conception. So then I have 105 ewes that lamb, I have 70 that don't, and I have my 178.5 lambs out here. And so then if I keep going using the same rates for the second year, and so I did 2 years because it's 3 times in 2 years, right? So to get through the whole cycle, you need 2 years worth. And it works the same way, right? In August, I would have the ewes that were bred in December, lambed, and were just weaned, plus the 70 that didn't breed in April, which would give me 165, and so on. And so when I do that, if I work out my average conception per year, it's 78.7. Okay, and that doesn't look as good. And then if I work out how many lambs I'm getting, over the 2 years, I'm getting 1,227. And so divided by 2, I'm getting 613 a year. And so one of the things, I think that you need to do when you go to an accelerated system is you need to know how you're doing compared to if you didn't accelerate. And so if we do the annual situation, right? If I had 300 ewes and I bred them annually in December and I got, my December conception rate of 95%, I'd have 285 that lambed and I'd have 15 that don't. And at the same fertility that I'm using here, I would have 484 and a half lambs. Okay. And so I can see that, I'm getting a significantly more lambs per year on my accelerated system in this scenario. And so what happens if conception isn't as good? And so now if we say that, in August and December, the conception rates are the same, but say April is only 50% instead of 60. What does that mean, right? And so what that means is that my average conception rate overall goes down to 72%, and I have a few less lambs. I'm down to 571, or 71, 79. And that's still significantly more than my 400 and some odd. But still the numbers changed a bit and not a lot of change here. And this, I think, this is still, for an accelerated system, looking at these conception rates, they're still very good, right? And so what if it's not as good, right? So what if my August and December conception rates are lower than expected? What if they're 70% and my out of season's 50%? What does that look like? And so that brings me down to an average conception rate of 63% and an average of 535 lambs born per year. And so if I look at this in a table and I compare it to how many lambs I would have more than the annual system, right? In the first scenario that we looked at, we would have had 129 lambs more than the annual example we're comparing to. The next scenario, we'd have 94 more. The sort of poorer scenario, we'd have 51 more. And if this got to the point that I was getting 0.4 here in April instead of 0.5, we'd be down to 27 more than annual. And so I think it's important to know what's going on, like especially on the accelerated lambing, right? If things don't turn out a few times, at what point isn't it working? And at what point are you, is it better to say, back off the acceleration, get control of everything, make sure the details are all working, and then go back to accelerating? And that's a really hard choice to make. And so I think, when you look at some of these numbers and think about them, it's easier to see why you might decide to do it if things start to not go as well as they should. And it also shows the importance of, why you need to know what those conception rates are and what those numbers look like, so that you can always compare back to, what if I was doing this annually? What could this look like? And so a quick sort of aside that I wanted to talk about too is pregnancy scanning. So, you know, if the ewes are all pregnant and you aren't counting fetuses for feed management, pregnancy scanning is not worth it. You don't need it, right? They bred, everything's good. But if you have, a 300, if you have 300 ewes on an annual system and you get 95% conception, you still have 15 ewes that aren't going to lamb. And so, potentially that might be $1,600 in feed costs if it's 109 per ewe for the year and they're not giving you anything. The week of November 9th to 15th, 144 pound ewe was worth $266. She could potentially, if you could identify her and say, hey, I'm not going to keep her around for a year, that's, you've saved the feed costs, plus you've been able to secure that value from her. At the same week, the lambs were only $236 per head, 103 pound lamb. So it'd be actually cheaper to keep back ewe lambs and get rid of those 15 and feed them the feed. So, I mean, then you wouldn't have dollars left over to pay for the scanning, but or not as many dollars to pay for the scanning, but you start to see how you can make better decisions and change things if you do know that information. And in an accelerated system, it gets more complicated and more important that you know who's pregnant and who isn't as well. So pregnancy scanning, or even, using a ram with a harness, can give you presence of mind that your ewes are pregnant. And if they're not, you can potentially call them, or maybe it's going to point out to you that, your ram didn't work at all, or there was something really wrong, and 50% of your ewes are not bred and you thought they were, and then you still have an opportunity to actually breed them, right? Breed them again, solve the problem. So the other thing is when you're thinking about, do I cull a ewe or not? If you have information like, what is the conception rate for each breeding? So then, do I blame the ewe or do I blame something else in the system, right? So if I've got 20% that are not bred and that's unusual, I'm maybe not going to cull all of those ewes, right? I'm going to say something else is going on here and figure it out. But if it's 95% conception rate, I'm running an annual system, and I'm trying to decide, do I keep a ewe or not keep a ewe? Then I'm going to want to know, my opportunity cost is, what's she worth if I sold her on the market today? What is her past production been? What do I think her potential production is in the future? And I need to know what it's going to cost me to keep her if I don't get rid of her or cull her and she doesn't lamb. And so it's really important to have those numbers and do the math, because then the decisions are easy. And so final evaluation, is always, I'm saying, you need conception rates for each breeding and you need to know what they are, but you also need that final evaluation of number of marketable lambs per ewe fed per year, right? Because of the other things that can happen after conception. And so what if your flock conception rates aren't excellent? So now we've talked about what a good conception rate looks like. We've talked a bit about the effect conception can have on your cost of production mostly due to lost revenue or mostly due to lost revenue. And so what if they aren't great or as good as you want? And so we looked at this before, and we've talked a little bit about age, we've talked about genetics, we've talked about season. And so I also want to talk a little bit about lambing interval, stress and environment, nutrition and body condition score, and RAMs. Because these things can be quite variable, and sometimes they're not top of mind and they can sneak up on you. And you can have some unexpected things. So the first thing is body condition score. And so this is a table from New Zealand, and they did a lot of work on body condition score, a lot of different research. And so they have some numbers that they've come up with through many years of work. And so they say that, for their use, if they're a body condition score 2, on average, they can get a 92% conception rate. And they're going to have an average of 1.63 fetuses per ewe bred. And then as soon as you get to a 2.5, the diagnosed pregnant goes up to almost 98%, and the fetuses goes up to 1.84. And once you get to 3, it's almost 99% and 1.89 fetuses per ewe bred. And then over that, it stays relatively the same. And so I've done a little random math here again, because one of the things that happens with body condition score is that, we're feeding ewes in groups, and ewes are not all the same, and they're getting the same feed, and they're not exactly the same weights or the same structures and all of those things. And so we always have a range in body condition score. And so so if we see a couple of thin ewes, we're like, okay, that's not too bad, right? And then the other problem is that, we see a couple of thin ewes, and then we put the rams in and we breed, and, the thin ewes are pregnant. So we're good, right? And so what I've done here is I've just kind of, using the numbers that we've got here from New Zealand, just done a little bit of calculation. So if we assume that we have a 300 ewe flock again, and we have 15% of them that are thin, and so a score 2 instead of something higher. And so if 15% are thin, that would be 45 ewes. And so if we look here, I've got body condition score 2. If we've got 45 ewes that are body condition score 2, at 92% conception rate, we're going to have 41.5 that are pregnant, and we're going to have 3.5 ewes that are not. And we're going to have 67.7 fetuses. Okay. Now, if those same ewes were a 3, and so there's 45 of them, then we'd have 99% conception. So we'd have 44.5. We've only have a half a ewe. Imagine that. That's not pregnant. But we'd have 84.1 fetuses. And so the difference here is potentially 16 lambs. So even though it's just a couple of ewes, there's a significant potential on the lamb side by having some thin ewes. And so, of course, if they're thinner than 2, these numbers go down, right? And that sort of thing. But just to give you some food for thought on the body condition score side. Now, this here, it's a little bit messy, but we're talking about effect of nutrition on rams. And so nutrition and body condition score affect the ram's ability to get ewes pregnant. And so what they did here is they fed rams on 3 different diets, okay? And up here we have body mass or weight, so the ram's weight. So they started out on day 1. The rams were all very much the same weight. They divided them into 3 groups. So a group that got fed well, one that they tried to maintain the same weight on, and a group that was not, that was restricted on the feed side. And so the idea was to change their body weight and body condition score over time. And so they did this. This was a 63-day, or it was actually 65 days. It was a 65-day project. And so here we can see that, you know, they did a pretty good job of maintaining weight on this medium group, and the high diet, they gained close to 10 kilos. And on the low diet, they lost close to 10 kilos. And so they did a bunch of measurements with semen and the scrotal circumference. So this here is the scrotal circumference. And so when they started out, the average scrotal circumference was just over 31 centimeters, with a range just over 30 to sort of almost 33. And so then you can see the diets work the same way. So the rams that were on the low diet here, you can see as time passed, and quite quickly, right? Like 7 days, we've got a drop, 14 days, 21 days. And this is the drop in scrotal circumference in centimeters. And so we went from an average just above 31 to below 30 in 2 weeks. And then it continues to drop to, 27.5 at the end of the study. And then the maintenance group stayed similar throughout, and then the high, the average increased. And so, so the important piece here is that scrotal circumference is directly related to semen volume. And so, I didn't talk about these, sorry about that. So these charts here are the same thing. So this is weight, and this is scrotal circumference, and these are the 3 groups. So the colors coordinate, and you can see that on day 1, this was their body weight, and the 3 groups was basically the same. And then on day 65, they were significantly different. And then the scrotal circumference, very similar on day 1. And on day 65, the high was significantly different than the low. And so then the other thing that they found is the other measurements that they made. I didn't, bore you with all of the charts, of course, but the semen volume looked very similar. There was a reduced number of sperm in the semen for the low nutrition group. Sperm motility was much worse in the low motility, or in the low nutrition group, compared to the high. Interestingly, there was no significant difference in abnormal sperm among them, but there was increased DNA fragmentation or damage, which can be related to survival. And so this means that the not only can, a thin ram not breed as many ewes due to these, it means that in the ewes he does breed, the ewes could have more embryo loss than if they were bred by a ram that wasn't as thin because of this increased DNA fragmentation. And so then another interesting thing is that they've proven there's an effect of ewe nutrition on rams. And so what they did in this study is they fed the ewes differently. And so it was they were fed 3 different diets over 3 months, same kind of thing where they had a low, a maintenance, and a high diet where they expect to lose a bit of weight, stay the same, and gain a bit of weight. And they then, once they had these ewes, they judged the attractiveness of the ewes to the rams. So this attractiveness score, they did it before they started the feed trial, and they did it at the end of the feed trial. And so at the beginning, the attractiveness score was the same for all 3 groups. And at the end, it was significantly different between the ewes that lost weight and the ewes that gained weight. And so they found these rams preferentially mated heavier ewes in better body condition. And so how they did that was they grouped the ewes. They had a number of repetitions, but they had 6 rams, and each ram was exposed to groups of 6 ewes, two ewes from each of the feeding regimes. Okay. And so that ram would be put in with the 6 ewes, and basically they would wait and monitor who that ram was interested in breeding and who he bred. And so when he chose a ewe and bred her, because they synchronized them so they were in estrus, and then they would take her out and leave him with 5 until the next one was done. And then they'd take her out and leave him with 4, etc. And so then they'd rank the ewes in attractiveness that way. And so each of the 6 rams, so every ewe was ranked by 6 rams, is I guess the easiest way to say it. And there were 48 ewes altogether. And so very interesting that the rams are able to tell which ewes are on a higher nutritional plane and preferentially mate them. So in a commercial situation, you know, you're going to see rams that favor ewes, and this is one of the reasons that they're favoring them, because at the beginning they didn't particularly favor any particular group over another. So that's quite interesting. They also measured ewe sexual behavior, and there was no difference for the ewes. The ewes, regardless of their nutritional status, did the same amount of following of the rams, you know, trying to get his attention and those kinds of things. So the other thing on rams is that, you know, in order to make sure that your conception rates are reasonable, it's really important that you do a breeding soundness examination 8 to 12 weeks prior to breeding. So just like we talked about with body condition score, has a huge effect if the ewe happens to, or the ram happens to be thin, has a huge effect on his semen quality, semen volume, and ability to get those ewes bred well. And you need time to change that if it's not right. Feet and legs, right? If they're lame, if they don't feel good, if it's hard to walk, they're not going to breed as many ewes as often. Testicles need to be palpated, make sure they're firm, that there's no lumps, nothing strange going on there. And the prepuce needs to be examined to make sure there's no infection or something going on. And this is something that you can ask your vet to show you how to check, right? Like some people would like to have their vet come out and check the rams, which is fine. If you're running an annual system and you have an annual health visit, you could do it as part of the health visit and sort of schedule it at a good time to do that, right? And if you're running an accelerated system and you need to do it more often because you're breeding more often, then it's something you can learn to check yourself. And most of the time they're going to be fine. But if they're not, it's going to have an effect on those conception rates. And then the other thing that we've seen from some of these tables and whatnot is that it's worthwhile to use the RAM effect when you're trying to breed in August. So if you're trying to advance the season or breed early in the fall season, it's worthwhile. And it's also worthwhile if you're breeding late in the season to use that RAM effect. And you can do it with a teaser RAM for 14 to 17 days. And you can also do it with intact rams that can't get to the ewes. It's not as effective, but it does have an effect. The biggest thing is that for a ram effect to work, the ewes have to be separated from them for at least a month. They can't be able to see, hear, or smell them. And then you get a much better ram effect. So another thing that often can sneak up on people is lambing interval. And so if you're running an accelerated system, rebreeding too soon can decrease your fertility and your prolificacy. And this is a study that was done in the 80s that really illustrates this well. And so these were Romanov ewes. And so as we saw, Romanov ewes, they breed easily to start with, right? In season and out of season. And so the ewes were synchronized using hormones, and they were bred using AI with semen so that there was no ram influence. And so what we have here is these are the number of days between when they last lambed and when when the AI was done. So the other thing with the AI is it was done on a specific day. So this is at 50 days after lambing, in season, 67% bred. And they got 2.7 lambs born per ewe. At 65 days, they got almost 76% that bred with 3.1 lambs born. At 80 days, they got 87% fertility and no real change in prolificacy. And then out of season, it's a little more dramatic, right? At 50 days, they only got 41% pregnant with prolificacy of 2. 65 days was almost 68% and 2.3. And at 80 days, it was 86% and 2.7. So even out of season, by the time they got to 80 days, they were getting virtually the same conception rates in those Romanovs as they did in season. And so these number of days matter. And, when you're on an accelerated system, if you're doing 3 times in 2, if you wean those lambs when the oldest lamb is like 70 days, then the youngest lambs, if you have a 30-day breeding period, the youngest lamb is only 40 days, right? And it's only been 40 days since that ewe lambed. And so it's that 40-day ewe that you're worried about, right? If you're breeding her back in 2 weeks, she's only going to be, 54 days since she lambed. And so it's just to think about that. And so what happens sometimes, in 3 times in 2, there's lots of time in that you can move it. You can, oops, I don't know what's going on there. You can move it so that the range sort of runs from the 65 days and up. So 65 to 95 days quite easily in a 3 times in 2. So that gets you in this range instead of down here. But what happens is sometimes you want to move it a little bit or adjust your timing a little bit for other things that are happening. And so you might, breed them back a little sooner. And if you do breed them back a little sooner, you definitely need to keep this in mind, right? And it's not those ewes that lambed first, it's those ewes that lamb last, and how many of them are there, because that's going to affect your conception rates considerably if that interval is too short. So another thing is stress, right? So avoiding stress is important. As a rule of thumb, avoid stress for the first 30 days because implantation happens at day 25 and you want that embryo to implant. You don't want the body to say, wow, something bad is happening, let's not get pregnant. And so generally if implantation happens and then they're a little bit stressed, they don't tend to lose that or give up that pregnancy nearly as easy as they would before implantation happens. And again, it's that range in breeding that makes it more difficult. Waiting 30 days sounds okay, but when your breeding period, say, is 30 days, then that's 30 days from the day you take the ram out. So some of those ewes will have been pregnant for 60 days, kind of a thing. So you just have to remember that. Another example of stress that can be a problem or could start to be more of a problem for us with climate change is heat stress. And so I'm just going to talk for the next couple of slides a little bit about heat stress and the kind of effect it can have. And so in this research project that we're looking at, just to give you an idea, the temperature was 32 degrees C, 60% humidity. The breeding was done in November, so in season. And then there's different times that the heat was applied, and the ewes were all bred AI from the same semen, so that wasn't an effect. And so when we look at results, blue, this is control, all blue, and this orange is where heat was applied. And so down here we've got days after breeding. So this is day 0 is when the rams were put in. The ewes were synchronized, so they're all in heat. And so we can see that ewes that had heat from before breeding all the way to 24 days, that there was a fertilization rate of 41%, 100% embryo loss, and 0 pregnancies, right? And the ewes that got heat from the day of breeding on had a little bit more on the fertilization rate, but still 100% loss in embryos. And so when you can see this day of when the heat starts moves, and as we get further, so this day here is about 8 days up here. So by 8 days, we're getting a 70% pregnancy rate. So basically what that's telling us is if those ewes are exposed to heat stress at breeding, and sort of for that first week, you can have significant loss. once they get past the first week, they're usually pretty good. This one down here basically shows us similar things. Their heat, the length of time the animals were exposed to heat was much less, but they had similar things happening where, you know, under that, in that first 10 days, basically, they're getting some significant loss except for the controls. In this case here, they had only 25% get pregnant. I guess the highest was 75%, where they had some heat that was, you know, sort of day 3 to 7. But why that group was different from these, I'm not sure. But just some ideas that, you know, a sudden, even short heat spell can have a big difference or make a big difference in conception rates. And so in these experiments, they're like in a hot room, basically, so that it's not the same as having access to shade or a cool barn or things like that as well. And so then on the ram side, you know, heat stress can also affect your ram sperm production. And so if we look at so now we're looking at days before mating. And so one of the things that they know is that fully formed sperm ready for use are not affected. So sperm that are down in the epididymis, ready to be used, are good to go. But the ones that are not quite fully formed and are being produced are susceptible to heat damage. And so what they find in general is abnormalities start showing up about 9 days after the heat stress. That's, you know, so if you're taking a semen sample from the rams, about 9 days after the heat stress, you'll start to see abnormalities in the sperm, and that'll continue until about day 30 to 35. And the damage seems to peak somewhere around 20, 24 days. And so in this little example here, just gives you some idea of things that can happen. So in this little heat stress event here, 35% of the sperm appeared to be dead or defective, and they only got 45% who tested pregnant at day 23, but by day 40, only 15% of them were still pregnant. And then, and this, because they couldn't measure it with ultrasound at day 23, it was done with a harness, right? That they're not returning to estrus. And then in another group, they did with a bit longer heat event. They had a bit more defective sperm and fewer animals that didn't return to estrus, and then nobody got pregnant. And so basically longer heat events are having a bigger effect or worse effect. So, you know, a day can have an effect, and maybe you get 80% conception instead of 95 or something like that, right? And so there can be a lot of variation. Like they've used a lot of heat here. And so if we want to look at kind of what might happen in Ontario, this graph, so August 5th to 8th, I don't know if anybody remembers, it was a hot spell. It was very hot. And there's a temperature humidity index that they've developed for sheep. And basically it's because, you know, heat doesn't feel the same at every humidity. And so they put the two together. And so what they say is for their index formulation, they say under 22.2, there's no heat stress. From 22.2 to 23.3, it's moderate heat stress. And from 23.3 to 25.6, it's severe heat stress. And over that, it's extreme severe heat stress. Now, I'm not sure why they use severe and extreme severe, but anyway. And so what I've done here is each dot is an hour of the day. And so this is midnight on August 5th. This is noon on August 5th, midnight on the 6th, noon on the 6th, etc. So midnight and noon. And so this is each hour, and it's the index. So we calculated the index based on the temperature plus humidity in the formula, and we get these numbers. So below the gray line is no heat stress. Between gray and yellow is moderate heat stress. From yellow to red is severe heat stress, and over is the extreme. And so it's interesting because, you know, for me, myself, in those 4 days, it felt like there's just zero relief, right? And that makes sense to what we see here, that there was very little relief, even in the evening. And so potentially here, at that point in time, your rams could have been experiencing heat stress in some form, and it could be enough to affect their sperm production. So if you were starting to breed the end of August, you might, depending on where your rams were and what the temperature was like where you are and where the rams were exactly and all of those things, their sperm might not have been in as good of shape as it should have been at the end of August and the 1st of September. And so we're starting to see these events happen more often than we used to. And I think one of the things that that we have to think, like, we never used to really have huge problems with this, but what we're seeing is the big changes. You know, like when it's well, as we saw in November, right? One day it's like almost 20 degrees, and the next day it's, you know, -2. And so even though mammals in general can adapt fairly well to changes in temperature, we don't adapt fast, right? And so, and you adapt to what you've been experiencing, and that big change is when it adds stress. And so, you know, for example, in the fall, if it suddenly gets cold and it's, you know, 8 degrees, I find myself looking at my, you know, winterish coat thinking maybe I need to wear that. But if it's March and it's been -10 and we have an 8-degree day, I'm pretty sure I can go without a coat, right? And so the animals are the same. It's that sudden heat that you can get. If it's sudden and it lasts, they're stressed until they have time to adapt. So just an idea of how a sudden stress could affect things. So in conclusion, basically, good conception rates are essential for profitability. It's important to calculate them for every breeding so you know what they are and if they're changing. If you're on an accelerated program, you need to make sure that the number of ewes bred and lambs weaned overall is justifying your acceleration. And if you need to change conception rates, attention to detail is definitely key. These are small changes that can have a big effect. And, you know, it's those tiny details like, you know, if it's suddenly hot, are the rams where they can keep cool. Do they have shade? Do they have enough water? You know, I should move them now type thing. Or it's, you know, those small things that sometimes are difficult to get done depending on what's going on. Because there's many factors affect conception, and they have to be managed precisely to get excellent results. So thank you.
Thank you, Delma. Questions for Delma? And I know there's a few comments in the chat box. Perhaps we'll deal with those first. Apologies for the phone ringing in the background. So Delma, this is in reference to one of your slides with regards to your accelerated example where you had the 300 ewes, some lambing in August, some in December.
Yeah.
The comment was, shouldn't the 30 not lambing in the first August group get the chance to breed in the December group, i.e. have 130 ewes bred instead of, or exposed instead of the 100? Yeah, that slide right there.
This slide,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so this is because I had to start. I was having trouble starting. So yes, sorry about that, but I was having trouble starting. So yes, it might be a little better.
Fair.
Yeah,
Ken and Jim jumped on that one. So good eyes. Thanks for those comments. A reminder for other folks, I mean, we obviously prefer live questions. So just raise your hand and we'll acknowledge you, and you can unmute your mic and ask your question. In the meantime, there's one more in the chat box from Emily. For those of us breeding in the winter, do the extremes of winter weather affect the rams and ewes similarly as to how you discussed with respect to stress?
So it would depend, again, if they're stressed, right? So so you know, if they're if it's cold and they're getting lots of feed and they have lots of wool and everything's, you know, tickety boo, you'll see they're quite comfortable. They're not stressed, right? But I mean, if they're, you know, huddling together and all of those things, for sure it's going to have some effect on conception. Because basically, like, I guess the thing to think about is that reproduction isn't a primary objective for the body. Survival's first. So if the body feels like survival might not be easy, it shuts reproduction down in some form. So in an extreme case, they don't get pregnant at all. In a less extreme, they might still breed, but they'll have fewer lambs, right? And it's all about, you know, the body's kind of says, wow, I'm stressed, things don't look so good. I need to make sure I can survive, right? Because if the ewe dies, then there's no reproduction in the future. So the first thing is the animal's survival.
And I guess, I mean, I'm just going by memory of, it's been a number of years, certainly since I've done a lit review on heat stress versus cold stress, but it's easier to find the heat stress numbers. Like there's yes. Not that many countries. There's not that many countries worried about cold stress on sheep. So I'm going to ask you, Delma, can you go look for some for us?
I can look, but yes, it's true.
It's going to be challenging, right?
Well, and it's not only it's not even sort of whether they care or not, it's whether they have a big enough industry that they fund it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or that the sheep are where the temperatures are extremely cold. So Wesley has a question. What breeds were used in the stress in those research trials that we're looking at heat stress? And are wool and hair breeds affected similarly?
And so in these old ones, like this dot one was done in the US. So it was and I can't remember exactly, but it was something, you know, like suffix and something familiar to us in those. But there's definitely breed differences, right? Like the hair breeds do much better in heat, and the like there's sheep all over the world in very hot conditions, but they lamb annually. They have fewer lambs, right, when it's really hot, but they can adapt, right? And it's just, when we talk about the heat stress for us, it's not that sheep can't deal with the heat we've got, it's that our sheep can't deal with the change.
Or the acclimatization, right? Takes
Yeah.
time to acclimatize.
Right. So if it was hot all summer and then we get another hot spell, you know, everybody's going to be fine. And like on the ram side, it's all about their ability to keep those testes 4 to 6 degrees cooler than the rest of their body.
Mhm.
And so if anything happens where they can't do that, like if they get sick and get a fever, they can't do that. And, you know, a lot of sperm damage happens. And so if they have, you know, if you look at some of those hair breeds, right, they've got they don't have wool on the testes. There's none of that happening. And so it's easier for them to keep that cooler, or some of the breeds or animals, their testes will hang down lower, and they'll physically let them hang down lower when it gets hot, away from the body, to try and keep that temperature difference that they need. And so all of those things definitely adapt. And there's breeds that do a much better job than the breeds we have, and our breeds will do better over time if we get more heat. But so it's not that we can't sheep farm in heat, it's that we can have stress events and have less conception than we expected if we're not watching for it.
Or if we have poor conceptions, we should be looking
Right.
back at breeding period to see what some of the factors may have been, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's as simple as making sure there's somewhere where there's a bit of shade when it happens, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I seen someone had unmuted their mic. So if you still have a question, and I did see your name and now it's gone out of my head. So feel free to ask your question. Not sure who that was. If not, we're gonna have one last call for questions.
I got one here. It's Jim Bennett.
Jim, go ahead.
I find here on if you have like a rain event or a storm come on, it seems like they breed like crazy. Does that have anything to do with it's not really necessarily heat or anything, just maybe a cloudy day or whatever that'll really get them going. So I don't know if that's ever been recorded or anything, but just what I see.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know of anything that's been recorded, but you know, if it's something that makes them comfortable, they're going to breed, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I just noticed, like, you got a real rainy day in the middle of summer. Maybe it's just that it's cooler, but it just seems like it turns them right, gets them going. But
Well,
yeah,
and the rams really respond to any addition of coolness, right?
sure. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks,
No
Jim.
problem.
Anyone else? So I guess Delma, I was taking notes while you were presenting, and I mean our topic was, you know, improving conception to lower cost of production, or, you know, improve profitability, whichever way you want to look at it. But I guess for me, some of the take homes is yes, we need to pay attention to conception, but it's the factors that affect conception that we need to pay attention to more, such as body condition, such as what did I write down? Managing our lambing interval, in particular between lambing and that period between lambing and breeding, making sure that it's, long enough that we're not really negatively impacting conception and prolificacy rates. Perhaps using the RAM effect if that fits our breeding program, whether it's at the beginning of the season or the end of the breeding season. Obviously, the avoiding stress during the breeding period, RAM soundness, breeding soundness exams, and I guess lastly, I had the whole factor around heat stress in particular, especially for those folks that are breeding through the summer months, and even I guess even in the spring, right? We can get some sudden hot times in the spring in our out of season breeding programs. So I'm not sure if I missed some of your take homes, but those were my notables. I did some number crunching on your annual example, of course, that for every 1%, for your example, for every 1% change in conception, it was equal to $363 in either loss or added revenue, depending which way you're going, right?
Yep.
So I didn't know if you had a few last minute comments or summary comments you wanted to make over and above what you had on your conclusion slide.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think you said it pretty well, Anita, because really that's the issue, right? Is conception is all about a whole bunch of little details.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we want to, it's important to know what your conception rates are because you want to know if they're changing. Because if they're changing, maybe some of those details are sliding, right?
Yep.
And that's, and so many things come into it that they can slide easily without you noticing right away. Just like the thin U's, right? Like,
yep.
You see 3 thin U's, you're not going to think a lot about it. Or 3 that didn't breed, right? 3 didn't breed, oh well, right? Compared to not even 1. Maybe they're, that kind of thing. And you think, and the other thing that I find with the thin U thing is, you remember all of those U's that were thin that did breed, and you say, this isn't a problem. Because there's quite a few of them. And it's just those small things that can add up.
Yep. All right. Well, Delma, on behalf of Ontario Sheep Farmers, thanks for being our speaker tonight. And on this, I mean, it's always an interesting topic for me. Conception rates and trying to optimize is probably the best word. For those of you that had joined tonight, and we did have a good attendance, thank you so much. I mean, these sessions are designed and made for you guys, you folks. So we have 2 more. Next week is our Market Outlook with Steve Duff from OMAFRA, the chief economist. And the week following, we have a presentation on the off-calf Ontario, I'm going to get this title wrong, but the Ontario Climate Change funding. There is a new uptake being offered in January. So we thought we'd wrap these sessions up with just an information session on that program and what is eligible and what the 3 pillars of that program are for those of you that may be in a position to take advantage of that. So Delma, thanks so much. The rest of you, thank you for joining, and remember that Same time, same day next week. We'll be having the Market Outlook with Steve Duff. Take care. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Okay.
Good night.
Good night.